Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have a brief announcement before we begin. First, please silence or turn off your cell phones for the duration of the program. Second, we are delighted that Karen Armstrong has graciously offered to sign books immediately following the program. We have a few guidelines for that process. To join the signing line, you must have a signing line ticket signifying purchase of her new book, Lost Art of Scripture. These tickets are distributed when you pick up your pre-ordered books or buy books in the front lobby where you checked in, and can be obtained after the program. For those with special physical needs or with an infant, we will provide an opportunity for you to join the signing line before others. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Director of Literary Programs, Maria Arana.
Thank you very much, and welcome. Good evening. I am the Literary Director for the library, and it's a joy to welcome you here this evening. How many of you are at the library for the first time tonight? Well, double welcome to you. And how many of you attended the Library of Congress's flagship event, the National Book Festival? Nice. I'd like to see that. Welcome back. And how many of you have attended one of these, National Book Festival Presents? Good. Keep coming back. We like you. Thank you so much. Well, welcome to the Library of Congress's National Book Festival Presents, a vibrant new series of programs inspired by the National Book Festival and meant to bring you into the heart of this historic, dynamic institution, the Library of Congress, your national library. This is a brand new effort through which we hope to spark conversations, engage, inspire, and entertain you with some of the most diverse, provocative, and notable writers of the day. In every program that we put before you, say from the children's writer Dave Pilkey, to a conversation with the Haitian-American wonderful literary novelist Edwige Danticat, to the program you've come to hear tonight, we mean to connect the works of living writers to a larger history, a deeper understanding. We delight in making those connections for you, and we delight in provoking the kind of exchanges that make all of us more informed and mindful citizens. You're part of that collective mission by being here tonight. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for helping us carry this torch. I hope you've taken a moment to look at the display of religious texts our curators have put out together for you next door, and perhaps you've taken a tour of some of the library's vast holdings that will make tonight's conversation come alive for you. So we try to incorporate these features in every program, and we want you to experience the depth and breadth of this library, of your library. But to cut to the task at hand, I'm thrilled to be standing here to introduce one of the world's great minds on spiritual studies, a writer and scholar who has contributed richly to our understanding of faith, scripture, and the history of religions around the globe. She is, of course, Karen Armstrong, the current ambassador for the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations. In the event you don't know what that alliance is, it's a dedicated, ambitious body within the United Nations that mounts action internationally against any form of extremism. Karen Armstrong would like to make the world talk to one another. It's an alliance that nurtures communication and strives to diffuse tensions between those who profess different faiths. She's also one of the forces behind the Charter for Compassion, a campaign that she began about 10 years ago after she won the TED Prize. The Charter for Compassion is a publicly created document in more than 30 languages that urges the peoples and religions of the world to embrace the essential values of compassion, so fundamental to many of the world's core beliefs, no matter what your religion. Karen Armstrong began her career as a religious sister, a member of the Roman Catholic Sisters of the Holy Child in England, from which she separated when she enrolled in studies at St. Anne's College in Oxford to study English literature. She has been a teacher, a historian, a writer, a television personality on religious issues, but always, and above all, she has been an explainer, a connector. The lesson throughout in her new book, The Lost Art of Scripture, is that the world's major faiths and religions have more in common than you might think. The differences over which wars have been fought and the hard hatreds that have been made harder are, if you study the very heart of Scripture, actually very few and surmountable. It's a hopeful message. Karen Armstrong is the author of the best-selling History of God. She has given us consistently brilliant, deeply researched and thoughtful works, among them Through the Narrow Gate, Tongues of Fire, The Holy War, about the Crusades, Muhammad, a biography, Buddha, Faith After 11 September, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, and my own favorite, her gripping memoir, The Spiral Staircase, My Climb Out of Darkness. Now she gives us this timely and important new work, The Lost Art of Scripture, a book that explains where faith resides in our brains and our hearts. It is, in short, an examination of the way sacred texts have been co-opted by hardliners and fundamentalists around the world who insist that these books should be taken literally at their word, when in fact, as she argues so well, sacred texts are works of art. They are tools to approach the divine, roads to a higher consciousness. They were never meant to be rigid and unbending, written in stone. She's here to tell us about this clarifying work of history in a time of intolerance and mutual incomprehension. Her voice is at once a comfort and a clarion call. At the end of her talk, we will take your questions. I hope you will formulate them as she speaks to you. Please help me welcome the prodigiously talented writer and thinker, Karen Armstrong.
Well, that's a wonderful welcome. Thank you. Oops, that's so good. Now, why is Scripture a lost art? Well, first of all, let's think if you're reading a book like Pride and Prejudice. You're not astonished or even dismayed to hear that Mr. Darcy or Mr. Bingley never existed. We're reading Scripture in a very factual way. We're factual people. In the early modern period, we started turning in Europe and over here in the United States towards reason, logic, the Enlightenment. All of these things, and science particularly, have done wonderful things for the world. But it's no good reading Scripture, or say the stories of Scripture, as though they were factual, any more than Pride and Prejudice is. Because before about the 18th century, it was impossible to write history as we know it today. Because it's only since the 18th century when we started to learn about ancient cultures, we developed this science of archaeology, learned how to decipher ancient languages, that we could recreate the world of the past. And human beings as perhaps the older members of the audience will agree with me, it's more natural for us to forget rather than to remember. And Scripture tells us what we should remember. And it does so in a way that brings out the reasons why we should remember these texts in the stories of Scripture, what they mean, rather than what actually happened. Now, I've got only a few minutes to talk, and it's quite a fat book, as you see. So I thought that I would just focus on three things about how we misinterpret Scripture as a lost art. One of the things that I'm not going to go into in great detail, but intrigued me first and got me started on this project, was the fact that Scripture was essentially a performative art. Now, you've been, probably some of you may have seen those wonderful Bibles on display, but that's a fairly recent thing. Scripture before was memorized, and most people couldn't read until the 18th century. You recited your Scripture, you sang it. The Quran means recitation, and Muslims don't read the text as we do. Even when they're learning it by heart, they don't learn it from a text, it's recited to them, and they learn it that way. And as a Catholic child, I got Scripture filtered through the Gregorian chant and the haunting cadences of that chant. But we never read the Bible much. It was always done in this setting of music and also acted out in ritual. Because we learn things far more with our bodies, neurologists tell us, than with our minds. We learn more about human nature and the world through movement and gesture. I'm told that people, if someone is talking and they use a lot of gestures, people will believe the gesture rather than the words. Because the body doesn't lie so much. But I'm going to take three different things. And the first one is that Scripture tells us what we must believe, that it gives us truths that we must accept. It's a very odd idea. It came in rather late, round about the time of the Protestant Reformation. And you'll remember that Luther said famously that a poor man armed with Scripture can learn as much about the faith than any pope or bishop. Give everybody the Bible and they'll be fine. Well, that didn't work, because the reformers soon found that they couldn't agree with one another about what Scripture said, even on absolutely fundamental matters like the Eucharist. And this was so disturbing that from the beginning the Protestant movement was split. Scripture is full of it is not teaching us anything. And how can it? Because it is talking about a reality. We call it God over here. In India they called it the Brahman. And Brahman means the all. It is everything that is. It's reality itself with a capital R. So you can't define it, a word which literally means, coming from the Latin root, to set limits upon something. You can't limit God. As a Catholic child, at the age of 8, I learned my catechism. And one of the questions was, what is God? And in a single sentence, we had him summed up. God is the Supreme Spirit who alone exists of himself and is infinite in all perfections. Well, at 8, I have to say that left me rather cold. But I now think it's entirely incorrect. Because first of all, it takes it for granted that you can simply draw breath and define a word, as I've said, that means to set limits upon a reality that is illimitable, that cannot be grasped. And furthermore, who alone exists of himself. Thomas Aquinas, before the modern period, who probably summed up European thought in his great Summa Theologica, said God is not one of the things that exist. All things that we know that exist are very temporary. They come and they go, they fail, they're feeble. God is esse se ipsum, he says, being itself. Like the Brahman, that force of life. And it's certainly not a he, who alone exists of him and is infinite in all. And it tells you nothing about God, and neither does the Bible. And I just want, because we've only got a little while, I just want to take one scripture that many of you will know well, the book of Genesis. In chapter 1 of Genesis, the famous chapter 1, we have a portrait of God, everything a God should be. There he is, in total control, totally powerful. He simply has to speak and it comes into being. Unlike other creation stories, which the Bible also includes, God doesn't have to fight any terrible monsters, sea monsters, in order to... creation's no great struggle to him. He speaks and it is done. And God is totally good and fair. At the end of every day, he's very benign. He blesses everything that he has made and says, it is good. Even his old enemy Leviathan, the sea monster that in other stories he's supposed to have destroyed, he blesses him. And the two are peaceful. Now, the rest of the book of Genesis systematically undercuts that nice picture of God. By the end of chapter 3, the God who was in total control of his creation has lost control of, can't manage them at all, human beings. They're off on their own. The God who was so benign becomes a cruel destroyer in the time of the flood. In a fit of what we can only call pique, he decides to destroy the whole human race. He saves Noah and his family, and one wonders why. As soon as Noah gets out of the ark, he gets drunk and commits some horrible sexual act. But he wipes out the entire world. So much for the benign God. And the God who was completely impartial in chapter 1, blessing all that he has made, has monstrous favorites. He's endlessly choosing one person after another for no good reason as far as we can see. Cain and Abel. Cain comes and brings his sacrifice. God says no. He takes Abel's sacrifice instead. Why? No reason at all. And where the Hebrew tells us that his face crumples like the face of a child when it is shocked by something, and it puts iron in Cain's soul, and you have the first murder when he kills his brother Abel. And he goes on doing this, God does. He chooses Jacob rather than Esau, the older twin. And you're made to feel the pain of the rejected one. Have you no blessing for me, Father? Esau cries in despair. What, Father, bless me too? And Isaac cannot do it. And poor Hagar, just dumped in the desert with her baby son by Abraham at God's command to face almost certain death. This is not the benign God we think. And at the end of the book of Genesis, God, who is continually butting in and intervening and appearing and advising, disappears from the world. And Joseph and his brothers have to struggle with their own insights and dreams, just as we do. That image of God has been steadily undercut, because this is the world that we know. This is a world where people do die in terrible, senseless disasters, natural disasters. And this is a world that is not fair. None of those people that he's chosen is particularly good or better than the other, and yet they're the ones that prosper and get the blessing, and that is what we see, always. And we're left at the end wondering, what is this God? And notice when, later on, Moses meets God in the burning bush and says, "What is your name?" Because to know the name of someone gives you power over them. God says, Eyeh asher eyeh. In Hebrew, that means I am what I am. Now, that's been translated to say God saying his self-subsistent being. But this is very early Hebrew, and they didn't have that kind of metaphysical thoughts yet. They hadn't developed a metaphysical tradition. It's a phrase used in Hebrew of deliberate vagueness. When you say, the Bible will say, they went where they went, it means I don't know where they went. And what God is saying is basically, mind your own business. Don't ask me. And similarly, he chooses Moses, the stammerer, to speak for him. And Moses says to him, "Look, God," at one point, "why are you choosing me? Ever since a child, I've had this terrible speech impediment, and no one can hear a word I say." And God says, "Never mind, Aaron will speak for you, your brother Aaron. He will say." So we're only getting what God has said to Moses at second hand, and you wonder really how much Moses has understood. And furthermore, it is Aaron, the facile speaker, who is guilty of the archetypal idolatry, because it's his idea that the Israelites worship the God in the form of a golden calf, narrowing God down to a single image. Moses, he still prefers Moses, who cannot speak because God's is unspeakable. And the great Taoist scripture, the Tao Te Ching, begins, "The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao." If you can say what God is, if you can say what the Tao is, that's not the Tao. If you can say what it is, as I glibly did in the Catholic Catechism, that's not God at all. Heaven does not speak, said Confucius, of the highest reality in Confucianism. Heaven does not speak. We just get glimpses of what we can see. In one of the Taoist scriptures too, Confucius's nephew is supposed to say, I sit quietly and forget. I forget everything I've been told. Not building up all this knowledge about God. So Scripture is not telling us what we should believe. It is rather opening our minds and hearts to the fact that when we speak about God, we do not know what we're talking about. It's the illimitable. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. Very early in the 10th century, the BCE, the priests of India, ancient India, used to have a competition. And they would go off into the wilderness and they would fast and pray, and then they would come together. The Indians loved competitions. And the object of it was to find a word that summed up the Brahman that I mentioned earlier, the all, that is everything that is. And so the first priest, the challenger, you drawing on all his huge learning and all his mystical experience, would come out with a phrase that he thought summed up the Brahman, the all. And the other priests would have to reply, build upon that and reply. But the priest who won the competition was the one that reduced them all to silence. And in that silence, the Brahman was present. The Brahman was not present in the learned declarations, but in the sudden realization of the impotence of speech when you face the divine. And so when we go, why did we have catechisms in the first place? Because after the reformers found they couldn't agree themselves upon scripture, they said there was no thought of letting ordinary people read the Bible anymore. That was clearly out. And so they had to have catechisms instead, and both the Catholic leaders and the Protestants did this. So you have so that you would approach the scriptures through a set of catechism answers, theological answers divided by human beings, like that, what is God? And not the muddle of scripture. One of India's favorite scriptures is the Mahabharata, a story, a terrible story of an appalling war. It's hard to see any light or glimmer of hope in it at all. Even at the very end, when the heroes all go to heaven, it's not clear that there is a heaven at all, actually. You're not left wondering whether heaven exists, and certainly you're left in grave doubt about what the gods are up to. And yet that is one of India's best-loved scriptures, because instead of giving us answers, it plunges us into obscurity. Get rid of your catechisms and let yourself see the ambiguity of scripture. Okay, point 2 here. Scripture does not expect us to go back to the original meaning of the text. Now, in modern scholarship, that's what we do, isn't it? We go back to find the earliest account of something or the earliest version of a story or something. We go back to the original text. And indeed, that's what the Protestants reformers wanted to do. They wanted to go back to the early church, to reproduce the early church. But there's a problem about that, because they were men and women of the early modern period, not the first century of Christianity. And it's impossible for us to go back, especially as all the first Christians were Jews who had an entirely different view of Scripture. But we're still doing that today, and sometimes in very distorted forms. You've got, in Saudi Arabia, for example, the Wahhabis, who reproduced a lot of 7th century customs and mores, and going back to what the Prophet had done at that time. But they're not men and women of the 7th century. And there are even fundamentalists in this country who have suggested that we revive the old Hebrew legislation, which would include the stoning of disobedient children. We're not programmed to do this. Scripture is an innovative art. And in every scripture tradition that I have studied, and I found this out while I didn't know this at the beginning of my research, it insists that you move forward and apply it to the present. Invent it, if you like. The Jewish people, after they lost their temple, which was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, could not read the old Hebrew texts in the same way, and again, because the whole of their spirituality had centered around the temple, and there was a terrible hole right in the heart of the scripture. But they didn't just chuck it out. They developed something called midrash, which means to go in. It comes from a verb, darash, which means to go in search of something. So you would take So someone would come to one of the rabbis and ask him a question, and he would answer it by taking a verse from the book of Psalms, say, or another verse from one of the prophets, and then perhaps another from the book of Genesis, texts that have no relation to one another, bung them all together, and there you've got an answer that answers this particular question. So it was inventive. And there was a story, this form, Midrash, was invented and perfected by the great Rabbi Akiva, who was killed by the Romans in the early 2nd century. And there was a story told in the Talmud about it that the fame of his brilliance was so great that it reached heaven. And Moses got to hear about this, and he was intrigued. So he wanted to find out what was happening. So he came down to earth and attended Rabbi Akiva's scripture class. And he sat in the back row at the very back, but found to his intense embarrassment that he couldn't understand a word of the Torah that Rabbi Akiva was expounding, the Torah that had been revealed to him on Mount Sinai. But instead of being miffed about it, he goes back to heaven, shaking his head proudly, rather like a proud father, saying, "My children have defeated me. But they've grown up, they've gone beyond me." One rabbi put it this way. He said that every time that which was not revealed to Moses was revealed to Rabbi Akiva and his generation. Scripture revelation was not something that had happened once in the distant past. It was present whenever a Jewish student with his teacher confronted the sacred text and found something new in it. And in the early versions of the Talmud, there would be a page on which the student must imbibe his own thoughts, his own discoveries. He would be standing, and they were told to imagine that he and his master were standing together on Mount Sinai with Moses and taking the revelation further. Because revelation was not something that had happened once in the past. It happened every time a Jew confronted the sacred texts. And the New Testament, the writers of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, and Luke particularly, have formed their own kind of midrash. Theirs is a little different, more like the sectarians in Qumran by the Dead Sea, which saw their own movement predicted in the past. And Matthew, for example, never misses a chance of taking a bit from the Old Testament, as they called it, and applying it to Jesus. He quotes the prophet Hosea and said, "I took my son out of Egypt." And well, obviously, Hosea was talking about the exodus of Egypt with Moses. But no, Matthew applies it to the baby Jesus, who was forced to flee King Herod. But when things died down, he came back to Palestine and he was brought out of Egypt. That's just one example. There's one story in the Gospel of Luke, the 2nd century, early 2nd century Gospel, which shows how this worked. This wasn't just a clever dick stuff. It was something that was profoundly emotive. After the crucifixion, 2 disciples are distraught. They thought Jesus was going to be the Messiah, and he died this terrible death. And they're leaving Jerusalem and going to the nearby village of Emmaus. And they're sad and distressed, obviously. And a stranger approaches them and says, "Look, you're awfully upset. Is there anything I can do to help?" I'm always relieved that those disciples weren't sort of stiff upper-lip Brits who would have replied cheerily, "Oh, no, thanks, we're fine." And that would have been the end of the whole story. But they do. They make themselves vulnerable. And the stranger would have laughed at them. But they say, "We thought Jesus was the Messiah, and look what's happened." He said, "Oh, slow of heart." And then starting with Moses, He goes through all the scriptures, showing how it applies to Jesus and all predicted his crucifixion. Well, the scriptures say nothing of the sort. This is more inventive midrash. And at the end, you know the end of the story, they have supper together. When the stranger breaks the bread, they see that it's Jesus and he disappears. And they say, and this is the important bit, did not our hearts burn within us when he opened the scriptures for us? Their hearts swelled with joy, and this was an emotive, insightful thing, not just a cerebral cleverness. And that's, Luke is saying, is how we will see Jesus today, in the breaking of bread, in this inventive scripture, and when we reach out towards the stranger for help. So Ibn Arabi sums it all up. He said that every time, Ibn Arabi, 12th century, wonderful Jewish Muslim mystic and philosopher, every time you recite the Quran, a piece from the Quran, it should mean something different to you. And if it doesn't mean something different to you, you're not reciting it correctly, because you're not sufficiently in the moment to say what you're going to do. Now, finally, I'm looking at the time, there's a lot of spirituality today that is all about me. I'm not condemning any of this, but yoga, for example, it was not designed as a sort of aerobic exercise. It was designed to get rid of ego. That selfish thing, part of us that always turns everything towards ourselves and is always thinking about ourselves. Let the ego go. And similarly, mindfulness. The Buddha designed mindfulness and told his monks to practice it, not so that they could feel more centered in themselves, but because they would realize their selves did not exist. The self was a fiction. It had no reality. There's scripture is not about me. It can't just tell us about our own private internal spirituality or our relationship with God. It must issue in practical action. And the story about the Buddha, we often see him, don't we, in lost in contemplation, in yogic trance. And he did do a lot of yoga. But there's a story about him in the Buddhist scriptures that when he had achieved enlightenment, he was basking in this newfound peace. And the inconvenient thought occurred to him that perhaps he should teach other people about how to do this. And he thought, well, no, I'm not going to do that because it's very difficult. It means you've got to let the ego go, and most people are just not going to be interested in that. I'm not going to do it. At which point, Brahma, the highest god in the highest of heavens, gave a terrible cry. And he said, then the world is lost. The world is utterly lost. And he descends from heaven, and the god kneels before the enlightened man. And he says, Lord, please preach your method. Look at the world. And the Buddha, we're told, looked at the world with the eye of a Buddha and saw the pain of the world. And spent the next 40 years, we never see this, but it's in the scriptures, tramping round the towns and villages of India, helping people to deal with their suffering and the way to overcome it. This is all the scriptures tell us to act. Later, he would tell his monks to do the same. After achieving enlightenment, he said, you must go back to the marketplace, immerse yourself in the pain and nastiness of the world in order to assuage it. You've got a job to do. This outward turning was crucial. The Confucians went further. They said, don't wait until you've achieved enlightenment. You will gain enlightenment by helping other people, because it helps you to put yourself to one side. And the Gospels are full of it too. On the last, when the kingdom comes to earth, those who get into the kingdom, Jesus says, are not those who will cry, Lord, Lord, and say their prayers nicely. But I was hungry, you gave me to eat. Thirsty, you gave me to drink. Sick, naked, and in prison, and you visited me. Reaching out to the suffering of the world. And sometimes, you go to church, sing a few hymns, and then go home to lunch. And that's the end of it. It isn't. At the end of the Mass, I don't know what they do now, but the priest would say, ite missa est, go, you are sent forth. And he didn't mean go home to lunch. He meant, you're now to go and immerse yourself in the pain of the world. And I want to end with the Confucian vision of how that should be done, because I think it's very apposite to our polarized and unequal world today. Instead, he said, you learn compassion, the Confucians say, and that meant the golden rule. Confucius was one of the first people to enunciate the golden rule. His disciples asked him, Master, which of your teachings can we put into practice all day and every day? And what's the single thread that runs through all your teachings? And he said, shu, which means likening to the self. Look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. And you do it not just when you feel like it, but all day and every day. And that means that all day and every day you're leaving yourself behind and putting yourself in the position of another. And that's how you gain enlightenment. Anyway, you start, the Confucians would say later, in the family. That's where you learn compassion and how to live with other people in relation to the family. And you can't go and put the world to rights if your own family is in disarray, but it can't stop with the family. You then move out into the next circle, the city in which you dwell. And look, ask yourself, how many people are sleeping in the streets this year? In London, for example, where I come from, rich city, 25% of the population are living in poverty. And we should be going out to that. Then to the third circle, to move out into the whole country, but finally to the whole world. And the whole world is now, we are so globally small, linked together as never before, unable to get away from one another, and yet we're retreating into nationalistic ghettos like Brexit, moving away from the fact that we have that outward reach towards the whole world. So that's what the scriptures are saying. Not to focus, just to sing a few hymns, not to slavishly find out what scripture said 500 years or even 1,000 years ago. What is it saying to you now? How will it heal the moment now? And remember that it will tell you nothing about God. It will make you realize that when you're before the divine, you've come to the end of what words and thoughts can do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Extraordinarily illuminating and inspiring talk, Dr. Armstrong. Thank you so much. We will have a question and answer with the audience, but I have a little surprise. Oh. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Mark Demunation, one of the great curators of this library, to present it. Mark?
Hello again.
Oh, hello again. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. You will recall you came through and we had the opportunity to show you some sacred texts from
I have.
And those of us who are fans of yours know that we've been on this journey for many a book in which we've learned that the sacred text changes over time and place, both in terms of use and meaning. Whether it be in our case from our collections from a 14th century Hungarian manuscript of the Bible to the printing of the Gutenberg Bible in 1454, to the printing of the King James Bible in 1611 and beyond, sacred text has always been in flux. However, there's one aspect of the materials that we showed you today which is a constant, it's true, and even as far back as the 15th century was real, and that is Jerusalem. And so whether it comes from Breidenbach's pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the 1470s and 80s, or to this, the image of Jerusalem from the Nuremberg Chronicle in 1493, Jerusalem has remained as the center and image of truth and reality. When all the rest of the world was displayed in fiction and fantasy, Jerusalem was always portrayed realistically. So as a remembrance of your time with us today, I'd like to give you Jerusalem.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you. Lovely to see you. Should I take it? I'll take it back with me. Thank you.
It's so wonderful when we can connect what we have in this vast library with something that you've just said. So that's a thrill for us. We will now take questions. Should we raise the house lights so that we can see one another? Questions for Dr. Armstrong. We have microphones floating through the room, and they will be happy to hand you a microphone and give you a voice.
For your talk. Do you think humanity has finished writing scripture? Do you see us creating more scripture?
I think. Well, one of the interesting things that my editor in New York asked me to do when he read the first draft of my new book, he said, you know, you say that scripture starts going off in the modern period when we start getting all analytical and scientific about things. And yet scripture's an art form. Perhaps there are artists who, at that time, were writing scriptures better. And I had fun with this, and I was right. So he said, why don't you include some? So I did, first of all, Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, Milton's God is a disaster. Really, that is the God of the catechisms that's coming. He's endlessly blowing on about foreordained and pre this and pre that. Utterly boring. But Satan is a triumph. Because what he's doing is rescuing goodness. Milton was a Calvinist, but he did not agree with the Calvinist doctrine of predestination, that when you're born, you are predestined to go to hell or to heaven. And because this is a disgusting view of God, and B, it was really torture. People were having breakdowns, and Satan had become a figure of absolutely monstrous evil. Now, we know that Milton read Hebrew. He was one of the few people who were allowed to read scriptures because the reformers said you could only read scripture if you could read it in the original languages, which had put most of us out of the count, Greek and Hebrew. And he read the Talmud. And on the last day of creation, the rabbis noticed that God, instead of saying it is good, he said it is very good. Why? Because, said the rabbis, on that day God created the evil inclination in human beings. Because we human beings are the only evil beings in the world. Animals are not evil, but we have these big brains. that make us do evil. So is the evil inclination good, asked the rabbis? Yes, they said, because without it, a man would not marry a wife or engage in trade, for example. The sexual instinct is good, but it can easily be perverted and become hurtful and harmful and dangerous. And in trade, which the rabbis were very keen on, you have to do your partners down and win and put other people out of business. But without it, we are a mixture of good and evil, and that's what Satan is. With Satan, he's a human being. He's made evil human. There's one passage in Milton's Paradise Lost where he sees Eve for the first time before she's fallen. And he becomes, Milton said, stupidly good. He's so lost and entranced by her. Milton puts onto Satan's lips soliloquies that are worthy of Hamlet or Macbeth about his regret for what he's done, about the mixture of good and evil that all of us are. And so there are other scriptures that I mentioned. I also looked at Thomas Mann's Joseph books, a trilogy of four books that tell the story of Joseph and his brothers, but it also discussing the rise of Nazism in Germany at that time. It's a comment on his own time. And finally, I took David Grossman's little book, The Myth of Samson, a difficult story, but Samson is a very unlikely hero. He's a kind of thug, really. But Goldman does, if you want to see what Midrash is like, you see it with Goldman. He takes, Grossman rather, he takes every single sentence and comments on it and comes out with some beautiful thoughts about human nature in the person of that unlikely hero, Samson. So, yes, I think we can probably, there are attempts to find scriptures, new ones. They can become rather sloppy and sentimental, but when they're applied with rigor in the way that Milton did and Grossman and Mann, and you have an intelligence that makes you see the scriptures differently and applies them to your own age.
It's a wonderful combination of scripture and literature. Thank you for that complete answer. There's right over there.
Hello, my name's Chuck. I had a quick question. Given the fact that we're in the world's largest library, and tonight you've reminded us that throughout the history of writing, the primary way we've communicated, taught, and learned was through oral technique, much of which we've probably forgotten since we've engaged in writing so much, since not only the invention of the press, but everything you talked about a couple centuries later. Do you see that in modern technology, social media, the world of all the various devices that we have, that we are shifting in some historic way away from understanding and communicating in writing to something that is morphing to some combination of something that's less writing and again becoming either more oral or visual and something different that we've experienced before? And are we moving into a new way of communication that may be something similar to the ancient but not quite?
Well, you may well be right. I'm not very hot on social media, I'm too old. Yes, you may well be right. What slightly worries me, we were talking about this earlier, about the phone, is that we're never in the moment anymore, though. I was telling a story. I was in Singapore recently, and I was in a restaurant, and a couple came in to have lunch together, and they sat down at the table and immediately took out their phones and started talking to other people, which they did for the entire lunch. And then when the guy's lunch arrived, he took a photograph of his hamburger. So he could say, we had lunch and this was the hamburger that we had. Instead, Scripture is asking us to be in the moment. And very often, when you see people, I see them walking up and down my street, which is a very pretty 18th century street in the middle of London, beautiful curve. And they're not looking at it, they're yaktering on to somebody on the phone. Or people are walking along a beautiful cliff and the sea, and they're chatting to someone in the office. We have to be in the moment. And I worry too in social media about the ugliness of some of it, the bullying, the fact that children are sometimes being driven to suicide by the unkindness, because you don't have to look someone in the face and tell them something horrible. You can do it anonymously without taking the consequences. And we've had, I don't know, probably you've had this here, but there have been suicides. And there are even websites where you can go to find out how to commit suicide, as a 14-year-old child did quite recently in Birmingham. So I think, but I'm not saying it's evil, because it's good and evil mixed, I think. It could bring us together more. And I think of the Prophet Muhammad for a moment, because when the Quran came down, he wasn't always on some lonely mountaintop like Moses. People would come and ask him about a problem in the community, a knotty problem, and we're told that he wouldn't just say, oh, I'll just think about that, or no, he would go think deeply into it, so deeply that he would grow pale and sweat even on a cold day. Sometimes he would shake with the effort of struggling to find an answer, and then out would come this message from the Quran, from the depths of his heart, the depths of his being. Sometimes he would say, cover me up. He would shake. But out of that effort, what he was doing was really entering into that moment with the whole of him, his body and his soul, entering to get as deeply into that problem as possible. And I fear that the whole idea of the tweet in whatever characters it is I think this could become a simplification as well as an escape from the present moment. The present moment is all we have. We might all be dead the next moment if something happened or a terrorist suddenly marched in. We don't know. And the scripture tells us to live in that moment. But I don't want to sound too much like a sort of iconoclast of this new, because I'm a bit too old to enjoy it and inhabit it fully. And I haven't embraced it much. I don't want to be endlessly chatting. I hate the telephone, or even the regular ones. I always find it an intrusion when I'm writing and then or thinking. So I really prefer seeing people face to face. But still, I may be one of those iconoclasts or those but it's probably a bit of good and a bit of evil, as all things are.
It was a great question, thank you, and a marvelous answer. We have time for one more question, I believe.
I'm prefacing this by I'm interpreting you as saying that A, Scripture is not closed, even though we talk about sacred Scripture and canons, and that B, the engagement with Scripture should not be something that we are just taking and freezing in time. Okay. In much of human endeavor, that's what we want to do. That is both religious scripture, that is to take the United States, the Constitution, to take communism, the works of Marx and Lenin, etc. It occurs to me that there is a dynamic here, and I would like your comment on this, that dynamic is one of fear. And it comes to me from the standpoint that once upon a time I pretended to be a musician. And as a musician, I never performed a work exactly the same, because if I did, it was dead. If I engaged with it, I discovered something new. So my question to you is, what you are saying about Scripture, it is like somebody performing a piece of music. You must constantly engage. It is a challenge. You don't know where it's going to go. And that should be informing how you relate to people whose scriptures are different than yours.
Yes. I think that's a really profound remark. I do think that. I think about the fear too, because I think that about fear, we are all frightened beings, and we have good reason to be fearful at the present moment. It is, I think Scripture teaches us, I think what I heard you say, Scripture makes us look at things that we're afraid of, like extinction, that if you do the same thing over and over again, exactly the same, somehow it's died, a sense of fear. And we are all frightened beings. We're all going to face our own deaths. We have to live with that. I think perhaps some of what you were saying is probably a bit about the death fear. And we want to leave our mark for when we've gone in that. And we go back to the past, but revive it, as it were, and make it live again in the present. And so, what was the last thing you said? Music?
In fact, performing a piece of music, if you don't perform
No, don't repeat.
Don't repeat it.
that means with that engagement to having the same attitude to those whose scripture may be different.
Yes, definitely, because we are now living in a world where we know about other people's scriptures and other people's religions. We used to hear weird and travelers would come back from far distant lands and tell us weird stories about what goes on in other parts of the world. You know, Muslims running around a little building. What on earth are they doing? Now we understand the depth and the profound similarities that we see right in China, India, the Muslims, Christians, Jews in their scriptures. And we see how profound the likenesses are as well as the differences. And that makes some people afraid because they want their faith to be singular. And it's when we began to find out about other people's scriptures that we started getting fundamentalisms, people going back and saying, even this is the bedrock of faith. Mine's better. But that's linked up too with the terrible wave of nationalism that is coming up at the moment. Brexit, for example. I keep saying it, but then if you've just come from Britain, that's all we hear about these days. And it fills us with, some of us with despair. And I honestly don't know how the country's going to come back together again after this. We are so profoundly divided. But here you have, remember when the Berlin Wall came down and people were dancing in the street? And then we've seen people cheering at the prospect of a wall between Mexico and the United States. So that you have a sense of wanting your little scripture, your little world to be the one. We can't do that anymore because the world is coming to us. And it comes to us in the form of migrants dying every day to try to get into Europe and the United Kingdom. You heard this terrible story about those 29 people from Vietnam recently who just died in a refrigerated car in Essex, trying to get into the United Kingdom. This keeping other people's scriptures at bay is a result of fear. And yet the scriptures are all asking us, as like Confucius, to go out from in a series of concentric circles to embrace the world and go out to all tribes and nations. Let me finish on a word on the Quran, with the phrase from the Quran, which is seen by so many people as an evil scripture. Most of them haven't read it, of course, and if they have read it, I say that's not how you read the Quran. Muslims don't read the Quran, they listen to it in Arabic, not this. But this is his last message to his community. He knew he would be dying soon, and they made the Meccan pilgrimage together, and he spoke. And he told them not to fight one another. The Muslim must never fight others, because we're all one family. And he ended with this phrase in which God speaks to the whole of humanity. And I think it's something that we need to learn today. Oh, humankind. And he's talking about Adam and Eve, that we all came from a single person. But I'm going to do a bit of midrash here and suggest that we all come from a man and a woman. We're each one of us a fusion of opposites coming together to make a new person. Oh, humankind, God says to the people of the world, we have created you all from a male and a female. And we have formed you into tribes and nations so that you may get to know one another. And that should be our task today. Thank you.
Dr. Armstrong, thank you for that enlightening talk in which you have brought us down deep to places where we don't usually go, and then brought us up to an illuminated explanation of faith and its true roots. Thank you so much. Please help me thank Dr. Armstrong, and please meet her at the signing tables next door, where you can actually ask her another question or two, perhaps. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.